Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Transgender School podcast. This is episode 48, and today we'll be discussing our post-election analysis.
So, as you probably know, with 312 electoral votes and a majority of the popular vote, Donald Trump has secured the largest margin of victory for any Republican presidential candidate since George H.W. Bush in 1988, making him the 47th president of the United States. Republicans have also secured majorities in the House and Senate, giving them unified government for the first time since Trump's first term in 2017. So today we're going to talk about why Vice President Harris lost. We're going to offer some poorly formed thoughts, or at least on my part, I'm going to offer some poorly formed thoughts on how Democrats can eventually get ourselves out of the wilderness again. And we will talk about what's going to happen now that Trump will take office with really fewer checks on his power than any president in US history, definitely in modern US history. So, my intention, I want to say this as a disclaimer, my intention in sharing my opinions today is not to claim that I am right, that I have all the answers, that I have any answers. My intention is not to blame Vice President Harris or the Democratic Party for their strategy. There are some specific individuals I will assign some level of blame, but not her, not the party more broadly. I don't think that these insights are unique, but I think that they're well informed by my 16 years of experience following national politics, studying political science, and working on campaigns for local, state, and federal office, including in Kent County, Michigan, which was a really interesting experience because that's a historically purple county in what is now a swing state. Whether a primary would have resulted in a better candidate is hard to say. I liked Harris as a candidate. I convinced myself she could win. Obviously, I said that on this podcast, but there's also a reason that California has never produced a Democratic president. And I think we ignore those reasons at our own peril. If one thing is clear, and there's one place I do want to assign some blame, the people around the president and Biden himself were deluding themselves when they decided to let him run for re-election, despite internal polling showing Trump winning 400 plus electoral votes. They put party above country. It was, in my opinion, an inexcusable decision, and it exemplifies the narcissistic, really self-interested rot that has come to dominate a lot of the US political class today, and that really led to Trump, what he described as the swamp. The right thing to do, regardless of whether it would have produced a different outcome, would have been for Biden to acknowledge that he was too old to run for re-election. He had no chance of getting reelected due to his historic unpopularity and declining mental state, and for him to allow the Democratic Party to hold an open primary from the start. So, with that out of the way, let's get into why Harris lost, at least in my opinion, and what lessons I think the Democratic Party should take from this election. So, first off the bat, I just have to say, as someone who identifies as progressive, as someone who is probably maybe to the left of the modern Democratic Party on still some issues, 47% of voters thought Harris was too progressive. Only 32% thought that Trump was too conservative. And I think that difference is really important. We really can't ignore that. I think the issues that played into that perception of Harris as too progressive and Trump as too conservative, which are backed up by exit polling and other polling, were inflation, immigration, and trans rights. Those were the most persuasive issues to voters, the most persuasive issues that convinced voters not to support Harris. So Republicans won on the economy, which is always the top issue, and they won on some wedge issue, culture war type issues. And ironically, they actually grew their tent in almost every conceivable way in the process. And this is where we really have to reflect as Democrats. So, compared to Biden's margins, Harris performed 2% better with white voters, 1% worse with Black voters, 12% worse with Hispanic Latino voters, 5% worse with Asian voters, and 12% worse with voters who identified as other for their racial identity. She also underperformed by 3% among women, 5% among young voters, and 11% among voters without a college degree compared to Biden. So I'm going to read a portion of a statement, most of a statement from Ezra Klein, who I really like, and I think summed up the way I feel about this election pretty well. He wrote, "The Democratic Party is supposed to represent the working class. If it isn't doing that, it's failing. That's true even if it can still win elections. Democrats don't need to build a new informational ecosystem. Democrats need to show up in the informational ecosystems that already exist. They need to be natural and enthusiastic participants in these cultures. Harris should have gone on Rogan, but the damage here was done over years and would not have been reversed in one October appearance. Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn aren't a Koch-funded psyop. What makes these spaces matter is that they aren't built on politics. Democrats already win voters who pay close attention to politics. That's probably most of you listening to this podcast. That there's more affinity between Democrats and the Cheneys than Democrats and the Reagans and Theo Vaughns of the world says a lot. Economic populism is not just about making your economic policy more and more redistributive. People care about fairness. They admire success. People have economic identities in addition to material needs. Trump and, in a different way, Elon Musk understand the identity side of this. What they share isn't that they're rich and successful, it's that they made themselves into the public's idea of what it means to be rich and successful. Policy matters, but it has to be real to the candidate. Policy is a way candidates tell voters who they are. Governing matters. If housing is more affordable and homelessness far less of a crisis, also talked about this on the podcast before, in Texas and Florida than California and New York, that's a huge problem. Democrats need to take seriously how much scarcity harms them. Housing scarcity became a core argument for Trump and Vance against immigrants. Too little clean energy becomes the argument for rapidly building out more fossil fuels. A successful liberalism needs to believe in and deliver abundance of the things that people need the most. Democrats aren't trusted on the cost of living, and that harmed them much more than any ad. Democrats don't have to move right or left. They need to better reflect the texture of the worlds they've lost touch with, and those worlds are complex and contradictory, as is Donald Trump. The most important question in politics isn't whether a politician is well liked, it's whether voters think a politician or a political coalition likes them. So that's Ezra Klein's take. I think he's more or less correct. Just to drive home that last point about how a successful liberalism and by extension, a successful Democratic Party have to deliver an abundance of the things that people need. The 5 states with the highest rates of homelessness in the United States are all run by Democrats. It's no coincidence that these states, particularly our big cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, produce among the least housing per capita of any of our peers. In California, environmental review lawsuits are filed against nearly half of all new proposed housing units. 96% of our residential land is zoned as single family only. And if you don't see the political connection, consider that Republicans just barely won the House of Representatives. Then remember that California lost a House seat and an electoral vote following the 2020 census because our population growth didn't keep pace with the rest of the country. In 2030, at the next reapportionment, we're on track to lose 4 congressional seats and 4 electoral votes. If that happens and New York's population growth also doesn't keep pace with the rest of the country, Harris could have won under that 2030 map. Harris could have won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and she still would have lost. Texas, a state that can barely keep its power grid functioning, now produces more clean energy than California because they streamlined their permitting process for wind, solar, and battery projects. We allow bureaucracy to hinder our efforts. Don't get me started on high-speed rail, nuclear energy, or really any of the issues on which blue state Democrats in California in particular have consistently failed to deliver on. So, in wrapping up my thoughts on why Harris lost and what lessons Democrats should take from this election, I do want to touch on those cultural issues voters found most persuasive, immigration and trans rights. And I realize that what I'm about to say is going to piss a lot of people off, but I ask you to hear me not as someone who is making a value judgment about what Democrats should believe, but as someone who is analyzing the politics of this situation and trying to imagine a world where we can one day get a Democrat elected president again, and where we can actually maintain the democracy that we have instead of cementing one party Republican rule, which frankly is what we're on track for given the demographic trends of this election. So I believe that Democrats in swing districts running for president should be allowed to sound moderate on cultural issues without being accused of caving on trans people or other, in my opinion, ridiculous litmus tests like that. This kind of litmus testing is why voters believed Harris was too liberal. We wouldn't let her express a clear position on immigration or trans issues. And in the absence of a clear position that she expressed, Trump got to fill in the gap. And whatever he said became true in voters' minds because he filled that information vacuum. Someone in the Harris campaign clearly realized this was a problem when she gave a weird non-answer about trans healthcare, saying that people should, quote, follow the law. But much like going on Rogan would have been, it was too little too late. It was a missed opportunity to express a truly moderate position that sounded reasonable to swing voters. But even if she'd done that at that stage in the campaign, it was probably too late. Would Harris have won if she said that decisions about what to tell parents or who can play which sports should be up to states and school districts? I don't think she would have, no. But I also wouldn't have faulted her for it. I don't think it would have hurt to sound reasonable on, frankly, very divisive issues that don't help us with swing voters and over which a president has little to no power. We're talking about state boards of education, superintendents, local boards of education. This is not a system that the federal government has a lot of authority over. Immigration. Obviously, the federal government has a lot of authority here. In a sense, it was smart to keep talking about the bipartisan bill, at least from an insider perspective. There were a lot of Republicans who supported it, and Trump only killed it because he knew it would hurt him to have a bipartisan bill led by President Biden that actually helped the situation on the border. But nobody knew what was in the bill. So, from a messaging standpoint, this was one of the fatal flaws of her campaign. It's clear in hindsight. She needed to express her own position, not just talk about the bill. And she needed to express a clear, detailed, and ultimately moderate stance on the issue. Remember, Obama opposed gay marriage and oversaw a significant number of deportations. Culturally moderate messaging gets Democrats elected president. See also Bill Clinton. And pandering to the base or holding back out of fear of backlash is costing us power. As a trans woman who cares a lot more about my right to exist than to play sports with cis women, I don't really give a shit what Democrats in swing districts have to say to get elected because I know they're not going to try to legislate me out of existence. And whether we like it or not, that's the bar that we're grappling with right now because Republicans have successfully made us a wedge issue. To quote an op-ed in the Harvard Crimson by E. Mateo Diaz that I agreed with, trans people don't need political lip service or empty virtue signaling. We need politicians who will do the work to protect us. Whether that work is done vocally or behind the scenes makes little effective difference. But again, I just have to come back to the fact that above all else, above all of these cultural issues, the economy is always the issue that dominates presidential elections. And even when we're talking about the cultural issues, it's how Republicans claim immigration affects the economy. It's how Republicans claim Democrats are focused on transgender rights instead of the economy. It's always ultimately about the economy. And the economy is good right now on paper, but Democrats, as we are increasingly becoming a party of the highly educated and wealthy, underestimated how much inflation would undermine the broader economic success that Biden oversaw. And I think that if there was one thing that would have changed this from a messaging standpoint, if there's one thing she could have done differently, it should have been expressing a clear, different economic platform than Biden. There were a few things where they tried to nibble around the edges and suggest some small policies, but she needed to go out there and say inflation is a problem and this is unacceptable. And we learned a lesson from the stimulus that we did, and we learned a lesson from XYZ. And here's my plan to make sure that we don't have more inflation. And here's what I'm going to do. And here's the bill I'm going to pass in the first 100 days as president. She needed something that candidates for Congress, candidates for Senate could go out there and talk about how they were going to actually make a difference on inflation and cost of living. And in the absence of that, the campaign was doomed from the start.
Thank you for that analysis, Jackie. I especially appreciate you saying, as a trans woman, I would have rather had a clear, moderate stance presented on trans rights than whatever Harris put out there was
Well,
not
I'd rather
clear
have
and
that than have
appeared
Donald
too
Trump
radical. Of course, I know.
because
Right,
that's the
right,
choice. That was the
right,
choice.
exactly. But I'm hearing some mind-boggling things. that people would have who voted for Trump would have voted for Bernie if people who are actually liberal on some of these views still voted for Trump. So I hear what you're saying. I think people need to really digest that and take into account that the messaging was all wrong. It wasn't targeted to the right moderate level, and it wasn't clear, and therefore people thought that she was too liberal, or they didn't know what her stance was.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up Bernie. I'm glad you did because I think he's a good example of where I would have liked to see the Democratic Party go versus where the Democratic Party went. Ironically, as I've gotten older, like I probably share fewer of Bernie's views than I did when I first voted for him in 2016. But when Bernie ran that campaign in 20, I mean, Bernie Sanders as a pre-presidential candidate politician had a rating from the NRA and was didn't give a shit about social issues, at least as a politician. I believe as a person he cares, but like, as a politician, that was not his thing. He was out there talking about economic populism and the millionaires and the billionaires and how they're
Mm-hmm.
screwing you over. And that worked. It really worked. And I think that that worked well in 2016. And I think that if you look at 2016 Bernie versus 2020 Bernie, you actually see a Bernie Sanders that got not on policy so much, but on how he talked about cultural issues and how he talked things like guns and all these other issues. He got moved into the more mainstream of the Democratic Party, and I don't know that that was the best thing in the world. I don't think that Democrats have to just triangulate between wherever they are now and wherever Republicans are. But I do think they have to be thoughtful about how they actually connect with working class people. And to Ezra Klein's point, like those are complex, contradictory communities. Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. Bernie Sanders would go on Joe Rogan's show and they would be best buds and they would chat.
Mm.
And how do we get back to having Democratic candidates who are in the mix for president who can do that, who can speak to people in that way? I'm not saying that Bernie would have won in 2016. Obviously, there's no point in rehashing that debate, but I think that a candidate in that model, you could be even further to the left on some issues, but if you were able to speak to working class voters in a meaningful way, that could make up for it. And I think that's what we're really missing right now.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. And I really hope people take this to heart, and I hope we can learn from it. And I sure hope that we might be able to change things in 4 years from now, since we're in for 4 years of madness, in my opinion. I want to ask you about one thing that you talked about earlier, because it really stands out to me. I want to bring up the issue of race and identity. I want to go back to something you talked about earlier, because I know personally I got swept up in the belief that because of who Harris is, she would have a better chance than Biden. I just pulled up an article that I was looking at from August. It's just a random article in Colorado Arts and Sciences magazine by Jennifer Ho, but this is the kind of thing that I got swept up in. It says many political observers and voters alike agree that Harris has breathed new light into the Democratic Party precisely because she is a Black South Asian woman. Many Asian American, Black, Latino, and female voters see elements of themselves in Harris. The celebration of her ethnic cultures, her achievements as a person of color, her unprecedented and path-breaking model being a woman of color who is the nominee of a major party seeking the highest office in the country. Black women for Harris, Black men for Harris, white women for Harris, white dudes for Harris, South Asians for Harris, LGBTQ people for Harris, among others, have all gathered in Zoom meetings in the tens of thousands with record-breaking 200,000 attendees, raising more than $15 million. So I got caught up in that hype that like, we're ready for somebody other than a white male dude to have some power in this country. The numbers that you shared a little earlier in this section of the podcast recording, Biden performed better in all of these categories. The old white dude, Biden, when he was running, and that Harris did 1% worse with Black voters, even though she's Black. She did 12% worse with Hispanic Latino voters, 5% worse with Asian voters, 12% worse with voters who identify as others. She underperformed 3% among women. This is mind-boggling. 5% worse among young voters. So what the heck happened here? Why did we get so caught up in the hype that everybody, all the Democrats and others maybe even were ready for a non-white older man to have some power in this country. Why did it not turn out? It turned out so far from that in the actual election.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going by the same data set that I pulled those numbers from, Harris did improve by 2% with Black women over Biden, and she did worse with Black men. And so I think that that's a complicated story. I mean, definitely involves some gender dynamics. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the first things that Tori, my wife, and I said to each other after this is horrible that I'm laughing at this, but like one of the first things we said to each other on election after the election results were clear was oh we're never gonna have a woman president in our lifetimes. It's never gonna happen. Like that's it. It's done. We've two women have run for president and lost. Why would we ever try again? So that's hard. I
Yeah,
don't
no, I've
know.
heard many people say that
Yeah.
they didn't, men and women alike, that they really didn't realize how entrenched just pure misogyny, sexism is in the culture, and that many people just simply wouldn't vote for a woman.
And I believe, and so this is what's so hard for me as someone who tries to think about things in an evidence-based way is that you can't you can't really do that with a lot of politics and a lot of actual political outcomes. Like you can't apply the scientific you can in certain narrow senses, but you can't say if not for her ability to connect with her inability to connect with working class voters and the Democratic Party's failure to cultivate those voters over the course of several elections. If that one thing changed, but everything else remained equal, maybe she would have won. Maybe America is ready for a woman president, for a black woman to be president. Maybe it was just that that's the issue, that Democrats have become the party of the elites, and there's this perception, and we're improperly putting it on misogyny, or maybe it's vice versa. Maybe she actually tried really hard to connect with working class voters and maybe on some level did a better job of that, but it was all because of the misogyny. I can't separate those things out. I can't say definitively, and that's where this gets really hard and really
Yeah,
impossible to a certain degree. What
yeah.
I do think matters is that there were people, I mean, you can read stories about this. There were people who identified as racists who said things I will not repeat on this podcast, who said they were voting for Obama in 2008 because they liked him,
Mm-hmm.
they believed in him on the
Mm-hmm.
economy. They didn't think
Mm-hmm.
Bush did a good job with the economy. There was a recession, there was a war they weren't happy about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was to go back to Kent County, Michigan, when I was in 2018, I was working on a congressional campaign there in what was historically a red district. It's become increasingly purple over the last few cycles, but 2018, it's an R plus 30 whatever district. I'm working for this Democrat who's running for Congress who has no chance, but we're running a serious campaign for the first time since the 60s that any Democrats run there. And I'm in Kent County, and it's this mostly working class, fairly suburban. If you go outside of Grand Rapids, it was the suburbs. The district kind of cut Grand Rapids out. So I had all the suburbs around Grand Rapids and the volunteers that would come out to work for my campaign, they worked in factories, they had real jobs. They don't have jobs like you or I have had. They have a very different life
Yeah.
experience. I feel like I really connected with a lot of people on that campaign, and I had some really instructive experiences. And one that I would share tonight is that there was a volunteer event where I was training a group of volunteers who most of whom were new and they were going to go out and knock doors for the campaign. And I was standing at the front of the room and I was giving my spiel and doing my thing. And one of the new volunteers entered is like, slow down, you're talking too fast. And I thought that was really funny. And one of my longtime volunteers, a guy who I really love, who was out there and came to like every volunteer event we did, he interjects and he goes, "Oh yeah, he's like a New Yorker with a suntan." And I thought that was really funny. I got misgendered in the moment and that
Mm-hmm.
sucked. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
standing in front of this room full of people and I had to make a choice in that moment. Am
Mm-hmm.
I gonna correct this man who I know for a fact has a lot better things he could be doing with his time. In fact, this
Mm-hmm.
guy had a wife who was sick with terminal cancer at home.
Wow.
He could have
Yeah.
been with his wife who had terminal cancer at home, but he was here volunteering for this campaign, because he believed in this candidate that I worked for, this candidate who didn't talk about the wedge issues, didn't talk about cultural issues, talked about
Right.
healthcare, talked about the
Mm-hmm.
economy.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, I had to decide, am I gonna start shit with this guy? Am I gonna make him uncomfortable? And am I gonna make this whole room full of people uncomfortable because I'm a little uncomfortable? No, I'm not. Because my ego and my own comfort is not the most important thing in the world. And actually building political coalitions with working class communities who can be talked into supporting progressive ideas if they understand how it's in their interest and they can connect with someone who doesn't talk down to them, who meets them where they're at. Like that, they didn't care that I was trans. They just cared that I was real with them and I could have a
Mm-hmm.
conversation and they
Mm-hmm.
weren't like
Mm-hmm.
intimidated to talk to me or they were going to say the wrong thing. And he
Mm-hmm.
didn't intend to misgender me and he never did that again. It was like a
Mm-hmm.
one-time thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I come back to that story pretty often, and I know that a lot of people would have handled that differently, and it's every trans person's right to call out being misgendered. I'm never going to take that away from anyone, but
Yeah.
I think those lessons can be those moments can be instructive, and I think we have to find ways to build those coalitions back because
Yeah.
absent those coalitions, we're going to be locked out of power forever.
Yeah. I absolutely get it. I hear you. And in an ideal world, he would be volunteering for the Democratic candidate and not misgendering you. But
Sure, but we don't live
I
in an
hear,
ideal world.
right. That's your point. I get it. Now we have Trump. And unfortunately, a lot of young people didn't see it the way you see it. And so here we are. So tell us about what comes next, Jackie.
So things get really, really bad very quickly for a lot of people in a lot of ways. Assuming that Trump follows through on his promises, which we have no reason not to expect. Here in the United States, things get especially bad for undocumented people and trans people, particularly in red states. Access to reproductive health care and abortion care will also continue to be restricted in these states. And I think that in a lot of ways, we will remember Trump's second term as really the end of this illusion that the United States is a cohesive nation. I think that he might tank the economy. I think there are things he would like to do that would really mess up our economy, but I do think that the narrow margin in the House will prevent him from doing the things that would have to go through Congress, at least most of them. There's a lot of things he could do on tariffs and international relations that could tank the economy. So to the extent that we could enter a recession, everyone is at risk from his presidency. And I think that really to come back to that idea that we're not a cohesive country anymore. Basic human rights and basic commitment to democracy just varies so much depending on the political leadership of a state now that any semblance of a shared sense of what it means to be an American is fading pretty quickly as far as I can tell and from what I'm seeing in the political discourse. And my concern is that this serves the interest of authoritarian leaders around the globe who would like to see our stronghold of democracy, really like one of the last big ones with a big, powerful military, they would like to see it destroyed. They would like to see our role in the world reduced to that of a spectator. I do think that Russia would like to take over more of Eastern Europe. I think that they would like to gradually dismantle NATO. I think they'd like to solidify control over the parts of Ukraine they've taken and probably take more than that. I think that China would like to take Taiwan, and I think that they see Trump as someone they can negotiate with, someone they can deal with, who might let them do those things. So globally, things get really bad very quickly for Ukrainians. And this one really gets me. I mean, they've defended their homeland against a Russian invasion. They have done that with a level of determination and resilience that not a lot of people have. I think that things get a lot worse for Palestinians. Trump will hand Netanyahu a blank check to establish indefinite Israeli control of Gaza and to further annex the West Bank. I think that will further heighten tensions with Iran and Hezbollah in North. We might see an all-out war between Israel and Lebanon pretty soon. We might see all-out war between Israel and Iran. Hard to imagine how the United States doesn't get dragged into that. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, an organization that was formed following World War II to track the risk of nuclear war, according to this group, the world is closer to Armageddon than ever before. So take that for what it's worth. And I think they'll update it again in January and see what happens then. Of course, the threat of nuclear war is not a super actionable thing. So personally, I try to focus on steps that I can take to build economic and household resilience in my own life. That means having contingency plans should the source of income I rely on be disrupted, or especially should critical lifelines, so the global supply chains that bring me my medications, my food, my other essential goods, if those are disrupted, I need to have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. And the same way that I prepare myself and my household for a major earthquake that could disrupt critical lifelines like water, power, gas, and cell networks for an extended period of time, I'm also taking steps to prepare myself and my household for potential indefinite disruptions to global supply chains. Because if Trump really decides to do something extreme, that is well within the realm of possibility. That means maintaining as much of a stockpile of essential medications, household goods, pet food, other supplies as possible. It means thinking, even if it's uncomfortable, in a very real way about what it would mean to secure your household during extended periods of civil unrest. That means having a go bag for yourself and your family packed and ready 24/7, 365. And I'm not just being paranoid, that's best practice for an emergency. If you live in an area with hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or wildfires or whatever it is, you should have a go bag for yourself and your family and your pets packed and ready all the time. Also, a good thing to have for potential civil unrest. Never let your gas tank go below half full. Think again, might be uncomfortable, but think very seriously about how you would defend yourself and how your ability to defend yourself might compare to other people's ability to harm you. At the same time, don't go out and buy a gun or do something that you don't understand, that you're not prepared to use. I'm not going to tell people not to arm themselves, but I am going to say that if you choose to arm yourself, please do go to a shooting range and learn how to use that gun and take courses and actually store it safely in a safe and be very responsible about how you store it and how you use it and train very regularly. And I know this is scary stuff, and I don't say all of this lightly. I know that a lot of people will struggle with a lot of the things that I said in this episode, but I say this stuff because I really love and care about everyone who's listening to this. And I want you all to have the best possible chance of surviving in what seems to be an increasingly dangerous future for our country. I can't say that things will get better in the short term. I think that there's a chance that Democrats can come back and things might get better in the medium to long term. But if you look at the Supreme Court, if you look at the federal government as it exists, there are no meaningful checks on Trump's power aside from maybe a handful of moderate House Republicans, and I wouldn't bet the future of our country on them. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think your recommendations are sound. And as you said, they're recommendations that you would make even without the Trump win, but now they become even more important. And I'm just curious what you think about this, Jackie, because a number of people I've talked to have said they want to get out of the country, that they actually, especially people who have dual citizenship, that can easily go and take their whole family to another country potentially. They want to get out there. And now this is enough. Just Trump being elected. I don't mean to say just Trump. I was devastated and I'm still kind of in shock and reeling and trying to figure it out, but I'm not going anywhere and I plan to stay here and continue to fight for the things that we believe in and continue to teach people things through transgender school, even though I do feel more afraid of putting ourselves out there in the public than I ever have because of the administration that's coming in. And if they do start targeting people, we're very public and out there. What are your thoughts about all that?
well, I mean, I'm biased because I'm going down with the ship no matter what. I just don't think in a world where we are the anchor of the democratic free world, I don't see how things get really bad for us and stay perfectly fine for most of the rest of the first world. Maybe I'm being overly pessimistic, or I'm inflating the importance of the United States on a global economic military stage, but that's my impression of it.
So basically
That's,
you can run but you can't hide.
yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. If I mean Trump is Trump is going to be president, and Russia's going to get most, if not all, of Ukraine. China's going to get Taiwan. The idea that the United States is going to serve as this barrier against authoritarian powers encroaching on sovereign states that has existed since the end of World War II, that's over. That's done. That is a thing of the past, and we are going back to a multipolar world. We've been in what international relations people call a unipolar world, where we've had this one great power. Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. America won. It's the end of history. That's it. There's only ever going to be one great power, and it's going to be America. And there's only ever going to be one system, and it's capitalism. And that's the capitalism part. He was right. The America part, not so much. I think we're going to return to a multipolar world. I think we're going to see Russia and China and their allies like Iran and North Korea become increasingly big players on the global stage. And I think that our role will shrink. And I think that what that means is that Russia becomes the dominant force in Europe, and China becomes the dominant force in Asia, and countries are going to have to realign. Countries like France, Germany are going to have to make hard decisions about whether they really want to remain in our orbit or whether it's in their best interest to kind of shift over to Russia's orbit. And I think that long term, all bets are off for what that means. The one thing that's clear to me is that it probably means that we're not going to live in a world that continues to have meaningful democracy at scale.
Yeah.
That just seems inevitable at this point.
Yeah.
So.
It's really sad and I don't know what to do with that, but I hear you and it makes sense. I heard you say I'm going down with the ship. What does that mean? And what do you plan to do? What can we do?
Well, I'm sure you all remember Sophia from our last episode. Sophia and I talk about this stuff a lot. Sophia thinks that there's going to be a civil war in the United States by 2030. So there you go, Sophia. It's on the record. Your prediction is stated. And I think I like to think it would take a little bit longer than that, but I do think that that's the trajectory that we're on with just the lack of shared national identity, the fact that Russia and China and Iran have so much influence over our national political debate through their ability to manipulate social media. And that's really understated. And I don't say that like, oh, everyone's a pawn. There's subtle, real manipulation happening, and the goal is not necessarily to always elect one candidate or another, but the goal is just to drive us apart and to make us hate each other and to make us not see each other as human beings, but as political beings with ideologies that we hate. And I think that the way that's going is that we get violent with each other. And I don't think that that happens absent some large economic some outside force has to act on us to shift our inertia. But I do think that our civil society is in a very vulnerable place to the point where if you do have that economic collapse, if you do have that outside force acting on us, it's very easy to imagine how that could quickly descend into widespread civil unrest. There's various versions of this that you could play out. You could play out a constitutional crisis where Trump federalizes the National Guard to respond to protests or something like that in California. And Gavin Newsom tells the National Guard that that order to be federalized is illegal. And they're not allowed to comply with that order. And he activates the state police, which respond directly to him. And now you've got the National Guard deciding on an individual basis whether they're loyal to Newsom or Trump. And you've got state police saying, oh, wait, Newsom's mobilizing me, but what if I like Trump? Should I go join the National Guard guys who are reporting to Trump? And you could get a scenario where you have different groups of armed people reporting to different leaders, and that could get messy. That's one path. Trump could ask the military to do something insane. They could fracture the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs could could go different ways and have different allegiances. There could be a military coup. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen on that front. There's also just the more realistic thing to my mind, which is just that you have a large scale economic catastrophe as a result of extreme policies or just a result of whatever global events, something crazy happens, and that you have a breakdown of civil society because the economy breaks down because people can't get what they need and people get violent with each other and then that gets fought more along class lines and that's not like a war for territory. That's about people coming into your house and killing you because you have food and nice things and they don't. So that could happen too. I don't know. It's hard to say. There's a lot of different ways this could go down, but there's a lot of violence in the air.
So, Jackie, that's pretty heavy and frightening in terms of envisioning what all of our futures might involve and entail. And so it's hard to hear a lot of what you're saying, but we need to be aware and we need to be prepared. And so, with the little bit of time we have left, can we talk a little bit about any kind of hope and what we can do?
Yeah, live your life to the extent possible until this stuff all becomes a problem in your day-to-day life. Live your day-to-day life. Don't make it a problem in your day-to-day life unless it has actually inserted itself. And I recognize that for many people, these politics have already inserted themselves into your day-to-day lives, and I don't mean to minimize that. But for those of you who are listening, don't dedicate too much mental space to this stuff. If you have anxiety, I have a lot of anxiety about a lot of things. I have anxiety about earthquakes. I have dreams about earthquakes. I think about earthquakes a lot. And I don't sit around reading about earthquakes and how they kill people and how they knock buildings down. I go out and I buy some stuff to add to my go bag, and I add some stuff to my stash at work, and I think about what items I might want to have and how I might better improve my supply at home to be able to shelter in place for a long period of time. If you have anxiety, channel that into something productive. Don't just be anxious for the sake of being anxious. Don't doom scroll. Don't just spend your time on social media looking at things that give you that hit of adrenaline because it scares you, because it feels scary, because that doesn't accomplish anything. None of these things could happen. Everything could continue to be fine. It wasn't fine, but those of us who are here listening to this, survived Trump's first term. It wasn't fine, but we all survived it. We're all here listening to this today. And so I like to think that we'll feel the same way on the other side of this. And until proven otherwise, just keep living your life. And even if any of these really bad things do happen, having been anxious and having spent time worrying about them won't have done anything to make you prepared. Only getting prepared and actually taking those steps will have accomplished something. And I think that, let's put it this way, I think that conservative people, by and large, are winning the prepping war on many fronts, whether it be supplies, whether it be arms and ammunition. I think that we as liberals and as people who identify as progressive and anyone on that side of the spectrum, we need to think really seriously about how we create redundancies and how we create fail safes and how we create plans for ourselves and our households and not take for granted the things that have been here for all of our lives or the institutions that have been here for all of our lives because they won't always be there.
Yeah, good, good advice, sage advice. And if you can say, just keep living your life and doing the things that you can do, I think that a lot of people can take solace in that. And I know lots of people who are not trans and who are in a privileged position and are in great distress, which I understand. But I think you're right. I think if we can listen to that and take that from you and also not give up in the areas that we can have impact and influence, we're still doing this. Some people said to me, oh my gosh, we got to get out of the country and it's all bad and there's nothing we can do anymore. And what are we going to do? Jackie and I are still going to do the podcast. I'm still going to do, I still did intake for a support group the other day where I got to help a mom see that her kid really probably is telling the truth that they're trans and needs some good support and some to see a doctor about getting medication that will support them. So we can still keep doing the things that we're doing, still fighting the good fight, I think, and not give up and not throw in the towel. At the same time, we need to see the realities of the situation as it is, as you have explained to us, Jackie.
I'll come back to Ukraine. If people in Ukraine can live their lives and go to their jobs and get married and have kids and have family events and dinners and go out and do all the things that people are doing in Ukraine right now, while they are actively defending their own sovereignty against a foreign invasion, if they can do that, we can live our lives while Donald Trump is the president. We can live our lives. We can get up and not read that article and not open Twitter, and we can just go to work and go outside, go for a walk. I've been going for a lot of long walks lately. Walks are a good way to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
separate yourself from all the screens and just get out there and
Mm-hmm.
breathe some fresh
Mm-hmm.
air.
Yeah.
Take care of yourself. There's
Yeah.
nothing to be gained from stressing yourself out about large things that you have little to no control over. Focus on the small, focus on your household, focus on yourself, focus on the things you have control over
And your community and where you
and your
can
community. Absolutely. Yeah.
advocate for equity and justice. And there are lots and lots of causes happening at the local level that we can be involved in that are making a difference and that will continue to make a difference. So it's not all or nothing. We can understand the severity of the situation and continue to live our lives, as you said, Jackie, and keep ourselves strong, take care of ourselves so that we can fight for the rights that we have some say in, some capacity and some ability to make a difference in. So I think we should probably end on that hopeful note. I'm glad and relieved to hear that that's your take on things and that your message wasn't everybody get the hell out and there's no hope and there's nothing we can do about anything. So I hope that people will have learned something about why Harris lost, the realities of our political situation and our country and how things have changed and that we're living in a very different country than many of us thought we were living in. And yet at the same time, we can continue to live our lives and make a difference where we can.
Well said. Nothing to add to that. Thanks
All
for
right.
listening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.